Losing everything in the city. My apartment, my fiancé, my reputation, my entire glittering life turned out to be the single best thing that ever happened to me. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I didn't believe it either. Not on the night I stood on a rain-soaked sidewalk in Manhattan with one suitcase and a phone full of unanswered texts. But stick with me, because this story has an ending that still makes me smile every single morning. Good day, listeners. It's Marissa Colt here, and I'm 38 years old. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. I read every single one. 3 years ago, I had what everyone said was a perfect life. I was a senior interior architect at one of the most prestigious design firms in New York. I designed penthouses for people whose names you'd recognize. I was engaged to Julian, a real estate developer with a jaw like a cologne ad and a smile that could close any deal. We had a wedding date. We had a registry at a store where the plates cost more than my first car. I thought I had built something solid. I hadn't. I'd built a house on sand, and I was the only one who didn't know it. It started small. Julian would help me prep for client pitches, and slowly his name started appearing on my proposals. "It's just easier this way," he said. "Clients trust a man's signature on the big numbers." I let it slide because I loved him, and because I was tired, and because when you're building a life with someone, you tell yourself these are just bumps. My best friend Priya saw it before I did. We'd worked together for 6 years, and she used to corner me in the break room with that particular look on her face. "He introduced you as his creative partner at the gala last week," Priya said, stirring her coffee like it owed her money. "Not his fiancé. Not the lead architect on Ashford. His creative partner." "He was being professional," I said. "Marissa, you designed that entire lobby." "He said my team 4 times and didn't once say your name. I didn't want to hear it." When you love someone, you build an entire legal defense for them in your head before anyone else finishes the accusation. I told myself Julian was stressed. I told myself the merger talks with his investors were eating him alive. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be very expensive lies. Then came the Ashford Tower project. 18 months of my life. Every sketch, every material sample, every 2 a.m. revision, mine. I remember the night I finalized the atrium design, sitting alone in the office at 1:47 in the morning, printing out renderings I was so proud of I nearly cried looking at them. I texted Julian a photo. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. The firm submitted the final proposal under both our names, but somewhere between the final pitch and the press release, my name evaporated. Julian stood at the podium in a tailored charcoal suit and told a room full of journalists that this was his vision brought to life with support from a talented internal team. Support from a talented internal team. That's what 15 years of my career had become in one sentence. I was standing 3 feet away from him in the front row, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for that launch. Nobody even looked at me. A journalist asked Julian a technical question about load distribution in the atrium glass, a decision I had personally fought the structural engineers over for 2 straight weeks. And he answered it confidently, completely wrong, and everyone nodded and wrote it down. That night, I confronted him in our apartment. I expected an apology. I expected shame. What I got was worse. "You should be thanking me," he said, loosening his tie like I was the unreasonable one. Nobody wants to hire the woman who cries in meetings, Marissa. I gave that project a face people trust. I didn't cry in meetings. "You will once you hear the rest?" He said it so casually, like he was telling me traffic was bad. "I already talked to the partners. They're letting you go. Restructuring, they'll call it. Don't fight it. I made sure your severance is generous." I stood there in my own kitchen, feeling the floor tilt under me. "You got me fired?" "I protected my investment," he said. "This wedding, this life, it needs a stable brand, and you lately are not stable." I laughed. I actually laughed because the alternative was screaming. "The investment? Is that what I am to you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer. I called Priya that night, sobbing so hard I could barely get the words out. She came over with a bottle of wine we never opened and just sat with me on the kitchen floor for 3 hours. "Leave him tonight," she kept saying. "Marissa, please leave him tonight." I didn't listen. I told myself 2 more weeks. I told myself I needed a plan first. I told myself a lot of things because leaving felt like admitting the last 5 years had been a lie, and I wasn't ready to admit that yet. 2 weeks later, my termination was final. 2 weeks after that, 3 separate firms I'd applied to sent identical, suspiciously worded rejection emails, all citing concerns raised during reference checks. I found out from a friend at my old company that Julian had personally called around, warning people I was difficult, unreliable, not worth the liability. He'd blacklisted me from an entire industry I'd spent 15 years building myself into, using a network of contacts I'd introduced him to in the first place. My name, the one thing that was supposed to be mine, was now a warning label. The engagement ended 3 days after that, not because I finally found the courage to leave him, but because he decided I'd embarrassed him by making a scene at Ashford Tower, a scene that consisted of me quietly asking one follow-up question about the atrium engineering that he couldn't answer. He kept the apartment. His name was the only one on the lease, of course it was, because 2 years earlier he'd convinced me it made more sense for tax purposes. He kept our joint savings account, because somehow, in the chaos of the last 6 months, most of the money in it had quietly become his business capital, transferred out in increments small enough that I never noticed until it was gone. My lawyer, the one lawyer I could still afford on my dwindling severance, told me fighting him would take years and money I did not have. "You could sue for the blacklisting," she said. "It'll cost you $80,000 minimum and take 3 years, and even then proving intent is brutal." "I have $4,000, I said. She didn't have a follow-up for that, so I packed one suitcase, everything else, furniture I'd chosen, art I'd bought, the life I thought I'd built, I left behind because taking it would have meant staying in that apartment one more night, and I couldn't survive one more night of Julian's cold, satisfied silence. Priya drove me to the bus station. She hugged me so hard my ribs ached and made me promise to call every single week. "You're not what he made you feel like," she said, gripping my shoulders. "Say it back to me." "I am not what he made me feel like," I repeated, not believing a single word of it yet. I bought a one-way bus ticket back to Hollow Creek, the small town I swore at 18 I would never return to. The judgmental hometown that greets its failures with open arms and sharpened tongues welcomed me exactly the way I expected. "Well, look who's back," said Denise Marsh, the woman who ran the general store and had run the local gossip circuit since before I was born. She was ringing up my aunt's groceries when I walked in for milk and eggs on my first morning back. "Big city didn't work out, huh, sweetheart?" "Guess not," I said, and kept walking, suitcase wheels rattling over the cracked sidewalk outside. By my second day back, everyone in Hollow Creek knew the story, or their version of it. Marissa Colt, the girl who thought she was too good for this town, came crawling home broke and dumped. I heard it in the church parking lot. I heard it at the diner, 2 booths over, not even whispered. I heard it, loudest of all, from my own Aunt Ruth, who meant well but had never once in her life kept an opinion to herself. "You could have called before showing up," she said, handing me a cup of coffee at her kitchen table. "I'd have tidied the guest room." "I didn't exactly plan this trip, Aunt Ruth." "No," she said, not unkindly, studying me over her reading glasses. "I don't imagine you did. You look thin, Marissa, and tired. That city chewed you up?" "It did," I admitted, and it was the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone but Priya. I stayed with her for 11 days, sleeping in a room with faded floral wallpaper and a twin bed I hadn't used since I was 17, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling I used to stare at as a teenager, dreaming about escaping this exact town. There was something bitterly funny about that. On the 12th day, I walked out to the edge of town to look at the one thing I still owned outright. The one thing Julian couldn't touch, blacklist, or put his name on. My grandmother's farm. 22 acres of overgrown orchard, a collapsing barn, and a farmhouse with a hole in the roof you could see stars through. She'd left it to me 8 years ago, and I'd let it rot because I was too busy building a life in the city that had just spit me back out. I remembered her voice from childhood, standing in that same orchard, telling me, "This land doesn't care what people say about you in town, Marissa. It only cares what you're willing to plant." I stood in that dead orchard, mud soaking through my one good pair of boots, and something in me clicked into place. I didn't have money. I didn't have a reputation. I didn't have a fiancé, a firm, or a 5-year plan. But I had land. I had hands that knew how to design something beautiful out of nothing. And I had 15 years of professional fury I hadn't gotten to use yet. "Fine," I said out loud, to nobody but the crows. "Let's see what a failure can build." I sold my engagement ring, the one Julian never bothered to ask for back, probably because he assumed I'd crawl to him eventually, and used every cent to buy lumber, tools, and a used truck that started only on the 3rd try. I moved into the farmhouse before I'd even patched the roof, sleeping under a tarp for the first 2 weeks like it was the most natural thing in the world. Denise Marsh watched me haul beams across the yard from her porch, across the road, and called out, "You do know you're not actually a contractor, right, sweetheart?" "I know exactly what I am, Denise," I called back. "Watch me." The first 3 months were the hardest of my life. Harder even than watching Julian dismantle my career in real time. I split my hands open on lumber I didn't know how to handle. I cried more than once in that half-finished farmhouse alone, with no Priya to drive over and sit with me on the floor. I called her anyway, every week like I promised, and she talked me through breakdowns from 3 states away while I sat on an overturned bucket in what would eventually become my kitchen. "Tell me again why you're doing this," she said one night when I was too exhausted to even cry properly. "Because it's the only thing in my life that's still mine," I said, "and I refuse to let one more thing be taken from me without a fight." I drew up plans at night by lamplight. The same instincts that had built penthouses for millionaires now aimed at something that was entirely, unapologetically mine. Not a corporate glass tower. A destination. Restored farmhouse suites with soaking tubs under skylights. An orchard-to-table restaurant using the ancient apple and pear trees I refused to let die. A wedding barn built from the bones of the one that was already falling down. I called it Hollow Creek Reserve, and everyone in town told me I was chasing a fantasy. Everyone except one man. His name was Nathaniel Colt, local architect. Born 3 towns over, the kind of self-made success story Hollow Creek loved to brag about at church potlucks. He'd built half the newer buildings in the county and turned down offers from firms in 3 different cities because, in his words, roots matter more than skylines. I met him when I was up on a ladder, trying to fix a section of roofline that was clearly beyond my skill level, and he pulled his truck over without being asked. "You're doing that wrong?" he said, looking up at me with an expression that was somehow both amused and completely serious. "I'm aware," I said. "I'm an interior architect, not a roofer." "Could have fooled me. You've been up there for 2 hours making it worse." I climbed down, ready to tell him exactly where he could put his opinion, and instead found myself explaining the entire vision for Hollow Creek Reserve, the suites, the orchard restaurant, the barn, while standing in mud with sawdust in my hair. He listened, really listened, not the polite nodding Julian used to do while checking his phone under the table. "You've got the bones of something incredible here," Nathaniel said when I finished. "Your structural plan for the barn is wrong, though. Load-bearing walls in the wrong place. Is that your professional opinion, or are you just trying to get on my property?" He grinned. "Both, honestly. I didn't trust him at first. I'd learned, expensively, what happened when I let a confident man start helping with my work. So for the first month, I kept him at arm's length, double-checked everything he suggested, waited for the moment he'd try to put his name on something that was mine. That moment never came. Nathaniel started stopping by, first with advice, then with tools, then with his own crew on weekends, working for a fraction of his normal rate because, he said, "This town needs this to work." He never once tried to take over. He never put his name where mine belonged. When I made a decision he disagreed with, he told me exactly why, argued his case, and then respected it when I overruled him. It was such a foreign experience being disagreed with and still respected that it took me months to stop bracing for the betrayal that never came. "You're not going to try to take credit for this, are you?" I asked him once, half joking, half terrified of the answer. 6 months into construction, both of us covered in sawdust and sweating through a July afternoon. Nathaniel's face went serious in a way I hadn't seen before. He set down the level he was holding and looked at me directly. "Marissa, every beam in that barn has your fingerprints on it before mine ever touch it. I'm not interested in a legacy that isn't earned. I watched my own father spend 30 years building other men's dreams and dying broke and unnamed on every plaque in this county. I promised myself I'd never do that to somebody else. I believed him. It was the first time in years I'd believed a man who told me my work was mine." The town's skepticism didn't fade overnight. A year in, the local paper ran a small, condescending piece titled "City Girls Farm Fantasy Faces Reality," quoting an anonymous longtime resident who predicted I'd be bankrupt within 6 months. I found out later it was Denise Marsh's brother-in-law, a man who'd never once set foot on my property. I clipped the article and pinned it above my desk. Not for encouragement exactly, but as fuel. Every time construction costs ran over, every time a supplier fell through, every time I wanted to quit, I looked at that headline and kept working. 18 months of brutal, unglamorous labor later. Hollow Creek Reserve opened its doors, 12 luxury farmhouse suites, a restaurant built entirely around the orchard's harvest, and a wedding barn that Nathaniel and I had rebuilt beam by beam, load-bearing wall exactly where it belonged this time. Opening weekend, we had 6 bookings. I remember standing at the front desk, terrified it would stay that way forever. It didn't. A national travel magazine sent a writer through on a slow news week, expecting, she later told me, a quaint little disappointment to write a gentle takedown of. Instead, she stayed 4 nights longer than scheduled and ran a feature calling Hollow Creek Reserve the most unexpected luxury destination in the Northeast. Bookings sold out 4 months in advance within 3 weeks of the article going live. Denise Marsh, the same woman who'd called me sweetheart in that mocking tone 18 months earlier, now sent every relative who visited straight to my restaurant and told them she'd always known I had it in me. I didn't correct her. I let her have that one. By the 2-year mark, Hollow Creek Reserve wasn't just surviving, it was the beating heart of the county's economy. I'd hired 40 local employees, most of them people who'd sneered at me on my first week back, including, eventually, Denise Marsh's own granddaughter, who needed a summer job and ended up staying full-time. I'd restored 3 other historic buildings on Main Street with profits from the resort, turning empty storefronts into a bakery, a bookstore, and a small gallery that showcased local artists. The town that once treated my return as a punchline started treating my presence as a point of pride, and I noticed, with a small private satisfaction, how quickly people's memories rewrote themselves once success was involved. Nathaniel and I had become something neither of us rushed to name, content instead to let it grow the way we'd grown the orchard, slow, deliberate, and completely real. He never once, in 2 years, asked for anything that wasn't freely offered. It took me a long time to stop waiting for the catch. "There isn't one," he told me once, when I finally asked him outright why he was so patient with me. "You spent 5 years with a man who made you feel like loving you was a transaction. I'm not in a hurry to prove I'm different. I'm just going to be different, for as long as it takes you to notice." I noticed. It took a 1.5 years, but I noticed. I asked him once, over dinner in the half-finished restaurant, why a man with his skill and reputation had never left Hollow Creek for one of the bigger firms that kept courting him. He set down his fork and thought about it longer than I expected. "My father worked construction his whole life," Nathaniel said. "Good work. Beautiful work. Buildings still standing all over this county with his craftsmanship in every joint, and not one plaque, not one mention, anywhere. He died 2 years before I finished my architecture degree, and I promised myself at his funeral that I'd build things where the credit actually lands on the people who earned it. That's not really possible in a big firm. Too many layers, too many names competing for the same line on a business card. Here, when I build something, everybody in town knows exactly whose hands did the work. That matters more to me than a corner office in a city skyline. That's why you never once tried to take over my project," I said, understanding, finally, something I'd wondered about for months. "That's exactly why," he said. "I watched what it did to my father, being erased from his own work his entire life. I wasn't about to do that to you." It was the moment I let myself fully trust him, not gradually, the way trust usually rebuilds, but all at once, like a door finally swinging open after months of being tested for a false floor. I reached across the table and took his hand, sawdust and all, and didn't let go for the rest of the night. The road to that 2-year mark wasn't smooth. Nothing about rebuilding a life from nothing ever is. And if anyone tells you their comeback story was a straight line upward, they're leaving out the parts that actually built their character. 10 months after opening, a storm system tore through the county overnight, ripping half the roof off the newly finished restaurant wing and flooding 3 of the suites we'd just finished furnishing. I stood in the wreckage the next morning in my bathrobe and rain boots, watching water drip through a ceiling I'd personally chosen every beam for, and felt something in me want to simply sit down in the mud and quit. "We don't have the insurance payout for another 6 weeks, I told Nathaniel, staring at the damage. "We have 4 bookings arriving Friday. 4. What am I supposed to tell them?" "You're supposed to tell them nothing, because we're going to fix it," Nathaniel said, already pulling his phone out to call his crew. "I've got favors to call in, so do you, whether you remember it or not." I didn't think anyone owed me favors. I was wrong. Word spread through town by that afternoon, and by Wednesday morning I had 11 local tradespeople on my property. Electricians, roofers, 2 off-duty firefighters who did drywall on weekends, working for cost, some of them for nothing at all because, as one of them put it, gripping a hammer he'd brought from his own garage. "You gave my daughter her first real job, Marissa. Least I can do is give you a roof. We finished repairs by Thursday night." All 4 guests arrived Friday to suites that smelled faintly of fresh paint and looked better than before the storm. I cried in the supply closet after they checked in, not from exhaustion this time, but because for the first time since Julian, I understood what it actually felt like to be held up by a community instead of quietly undermined by the person who was supposed to love me most. There was a harder blow too. One I don't tell often. 8 months before the 2nd anniversary festival, a regional hospitality group made me an offer to buy Hollow Creek Reserve outright. An enormous number. More money than I'd ever expected to see in one place. Enough to disappear somewhere warm and never work another day in my life. I sat with that offer for 11 days. I drove out to the orchard at dawn more than once, trying to imagine walking away from all of it. Trying to imagine what my grandmother would have said. "You don't have to keep proving anything to anyone," Nathaniel told me one of those nights, finding me sitting on the porch steps at 2 a.m. with the offer letter still in my hand. "Not to the town. Not to Julian. Wherever he is, not to me. If you want to sell and go live on a beach, I will drive you to the airport myself." "That's exactly why I'm not going to," I said. "Because for the first time in my life, nobody's telling me what I should want. I get to decide, and I've decided I'm not done here." I declined the offer the next morning. The hospitality group's representative seemed genuinely stunned that a small-town resort owner would turn down 8 figures. I didn't bother explaining that money had never been the thing I was actually rebuilding. Then the town planned its biggest event yet, the Hollow Creek Harvest Festival and Press Launch, a weekend celebrating the resort's 2nd anniversary with national travel journalists flying in, local vendors setting up along Main Street, and a keynote address I'd spent 3 weeks writing about turning ruin into renewal. Julian Vance had been tracking my life from a distance for exactly as long as it took my success to become impossible to ignore. I found out later, through a lawyer friend who still owed me a favor from my city days, that his real estate empire had quietly collapsed over the past year. 2 failed developments in markets that turned on him faster than he expected. A partner lawsuit alleging he'd misrepresented financials to secure investment. Debts he'd buried under shell companies and confident smiles. The same confident smile that used to make investors sign anything he put in front of them. He needed capital fast, and someone had shown him a national magazine feature about a 22-acre luxury property with clean title and 0 existing liens, photographed under golden late summer light, with my name in the caption. My lawyer friend called me 8 months before the festival with a warning. "He's been asking around about you, Marissa. Property records, business filings, anything public. I think he's planning something." "Let him plan," I said, though my stomach dropped the moment I heard his name. "I've got nothing left for him to take." "You've got 22 acres and a business worth 7 figures, she said. "That's exactly the kind of nothing men like Julian come back for." I didn't sleep well for a week after that call, but instead of letting fear run the show, I did what I'd learned to do in 2 years of rebuilding. I got to work. I quietly filed to have my grandmother's original deed re-verified and re-recorded with the county clerk, closing any conceivable gap Julian's lawyers might try to exploit. I asked my lawyer friend to formally request Vance Development Group's public financial disclosures, the kind any citizen can request once litigation involving a company is in motion, and there was, by then, plenty of litigation involving Julian's company. I told Nathaniel everything. I told the sheriff's department quietly that an unwelcome visitor with a grudge might show up at the festival, and asked if a deputy could be present as a precaution. Everyone agreed instantly. Hollow Creek protects its own now, and somewhere in the last 2 years, without fully realizing it, I had become one of its own. 2 days before the festival, rumors started moving through town the way rumors always do in Hollow Creek. Fast, distorted, and impossible to trace back to their source. Denise Marsh cornered me outside the bakery, uncharacteristically hesitant. "There's a fella been asking around at the diner," she said, lowering her voice like it wasn't already loud enough for half of Main Street to hear. "Slick suit, city accent, asking about your property lines, asking if anybody remembered your grandmother's paperwork ever being messy." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face steady. "What did you tell him, Denise?" "I told him your grandmother's paperwork was cleaner than his manicure, and that he should mind his business before I called Sheriff Dalton myself." She crossed her arms, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in her expression that looked unmistakably like loyalty. "You're one of ours now, Marissa. Whatever this town's not letting some city man walk in and take it from you. I could have cried right there on the sidewalk. Instead, I thanked her, went home, and spent the rest of that night with Nathaniel and my lawyer friend on speakerphone, running through every possible angle Julian's team might try. We rehearsed the deed, we rehearsed the financials, we rehearsed, more than anything, the simple discipline of staying calm no matter what he said in public, because I knew in my bones that rattling me was the entire point of whatever he was planning. He wants you to look desperate, my lawyer friend said, frightened, grasping. That's the only version of you the story works for him. Don't give him that version. I haven't been that version of myself in 2.5 years, I said. I'm not starting again for him. He arrived at the Harvest Festival on Saturday morning with 2 lawyers in matching navy suits, a forged document folder, and the same jaw-clenched confidence he'd worn the night he destroyed my career. I was mid-conversation with a journalist from a national travel outlet, walking her through the restored wedding barn, when I saw him crossing Main Street, and every hair on my arm stood up at once. Nathaniel, standing a few feet away, helping vendors set up, caught my eye and immediately understood. Marissa, Julian said, loud enough for the small crowd near the vendor tents to turn. We need to talk, now preferably before this gets messier than it needs to be. There's nothing for us to talk about, Julian. There's a boundary dispute on that land, he said, louder now, performing for an audience he'd clearly planned for. Your grandmother's original deed had irregularities. I have documentation. He nodded at the taller lawyer, who produced a folder like it was a magic trick. This resort of yours is sitting on land you may not legally own. I'd hate for that to come out during your little press event. A ripple went through the gathering crowd. Journalists' pens started moving. A local news camera swung toward us. This was exactly the scene he wanted. Chaos, doubt, a headline forming in real time. Luxury resort owners, land ownership disputed. Nathaniel stepped up beside me, jaw tight, ready to intervene. I put a hand on his arm. Let me, I said quietly. This one's mine. I smiled at Julian. I want you to understand, it was not a nervous smile. It was not the smile of a woman caught off guard. I'd known this day might come since the moment my lawyer friend called me 8 months ago with a warning that Julian's company was drowning, and my name kept coming up in his desperate phone calls to old contacts. I'd had 8 months to prepare a response of my own. Since we're doing this in front of an audience, I said, raising my voice just enough to carry, let's actually do this properly. I walked to the small stage set up for my keynote, the one meant for a speech about renewal, and picked up the microphone instead. Julian's smile faltered for the first time. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, before I give the speech I planned, I think you deserve to hear something more interesting. I nodded to Nathaniel, who, because we'd quietly prepared for exactly this possibility the moment my lawyer friend's warning came through, pulled up the projector screen we'd set up for the festival's promotional slideshow. Instead of resort photos, the first slide showed a scanned copy of my grandmother's original 1987 deed, notarized and recorded in the county registry, clean as could be, freshly re-verified. This is the actual deed to Hollow Creek Reserve, I said. Filed, recorded, and re-verified by the county clerk this past Tuesday when I heard rumors my ex-fiancé was preparing a legal challenge. No irregularities, no boundary disputes, just 22 acres, legally mine since my grandmother's passing. The crowd murmured. Julian's lawyers exchanged a look I can only describe as the beginning of panic. Next slide, I said. The screen changed to a set of financial filings. Julian's company's own quarterly disclosures, publicly available through the state business registry, alongside a set of documents my lawyer friend had helped me obtain legally through a formal records request once litigation was already in motion. This is Vance Development Group's actual financial position, I said. $2.3 million in unpaid contractor liens, a pending lawsuit from a business partner alleging fraud, and a forged property deed. I let that word land, slow and heavy. That this folder right here, I pointed at the lawyer's leather portfolio, was drafted to present as legitimate boundary documentation on my grandmother's land, except the notary stamp on it doesn't match any licensed notary in this county. My lawyer checked twice. A local sheriff's deputy who I'd quietly asked to attend the festival as a precaution stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Sir, I'm going to need to see that folder. Julian's face had gone the color of old paper. This is a misunderstanding, he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard in 3 years of engagement. Marissa, we can settle this privately. We're not settling anything privately, I said into the microphone, calm as still water. "You made sure my humiliation happened publicly, Julian, in front of journalists, at a podium with my project, wearing my work like a suit. So we're going to do this the same way." "You don't understand what's at stake for me," he said, and for one brief second I heard something almost like the man I'd once loved before the next sentence proved he hadn't changed at all. "I need this. I need it more than you do." "You needed a lot of things more than I did, Julian," I said. "My career, my name, my savings. I got used to you needing things more than I did. I'm done accommodating it." I clicked to the final slide. It was simple. Just text, white on black. From ruin to Renawal. Built by the woman they said was finished. The crowd erupted into applause before I even said another word. Journalists were typing furiously. The camera crew had abandoned filming Julian entirely and turned every lens toward me. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, not saying a word, letting this be exactly what it needed to be. Mine. Aunt Ruth, standing near the front with Priya, who had flown in specifically for the festival without telling me why until that morning, was openly crying and clapping at the same time. The deputy escorted Julian's lawyers aside for questioning about the forged notary stamp, both of them already distancing themselves from Julian with the particular speed of people who bill by the hour and have no personal loyalty to protect. Julian himself stood frozen in the middle of Main Street, in front of the entire town that had once mocked me and now would not stop clapping, utterly, publicly finished. I stepped off the stage, handed the microphone to the festival coordinator, and walked straight past him without another word. That was the moment I understood, really understood, that I owed him nothing. Not an argument, not a final speech, not even my anger anymore. By Monday, 3 separate outlets had run the story. The disgraced developer who tried to steal a self-made resort from the woman he'd once tanked in New York and got caught with a forged deed on a stage in front of national press. His remaining business partners severed ties within 48 hours. 2 more lawsuits surfaced from contractors he'd stiffed on other projects, emboldened by seeing someone finally hold him accountable in public. Vance Development Group filed for bankruptcy 19 days later. The forged notary stamp turned into a criminal referral, and I heard, secondhand, that he spent a very uncomfortable afternoon answering questions at the county sheriff's office before a lawyer he could barely afford came to get him out. He showed up at the farm exactly once after that, 3 weeks after the festival, standing at the edge of my newly graveled driveway looking smaller than I remembered him ever being. No suit this time, no confident jaw, just a man who'd run out of rooms that would still let him in. "Marissa," he said, "please, 5 minutes." I was on the porch going over the fall booking calendar with Nathaniel. I didn't get up. "I'm not asking for much," Julian continued, taking a step closer, stopped only by the low fence Nathaniel and I had built together that spring. "A percentage, 10%. I helped build who you are, Marissa, whether you want to admit that or not. I could disappear after that. You'd never have to see me again." I finally stood, walked to the fence and looked at him. Really looked the way you look at a stranger asking for directions. Nothing more. "You didn't build who I am, Julian," I said. "You tried to erase who I was. Those are very different things. I made mistakes." "You made choices," I corrected. "There's a difference between that too." "I have nothing left," he said, and for a moment, something in his voice cracked in a way that might have moved me once, back when I still thought his pain was my responsibility. It wasn't anymore. "I know," I said. "I read the bankruptcy filing. I hope you find your feet somewhere, Julian. Just not here. Not near my land, my business, or my life, ever again. Marissa." "Leave," I said. Quiet and absolutely final. "Before I call the same deputy who escorted your lawyers off my property 3 weeks ago?" He looked at me for a long moment, waiting, I think, for some flicker of the woman who used to forgive him before he'd even finished apologizing. She wasn't there anymore. I'd built her a new life and there wasn't a room for him in it. He turned and walked back to his car, an aging sedan that had replaced whatever luxury vehicle he used to drive, and drove off down the same road I'd walked into town on with one suitcase, 2.5 years earlier. Nathaniel came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. We didn't need to. "You okay?" he finally asked. "I'm better than okay," I said, and meant it completely for the first time since the whole nightmare began. I just watched the last piece of my old life drive away, and I felt absolutely nothing but relief. I never saw Julian again. Hollow Creek Reserve is in its 4th year now. We've expanded to 20 suites, a second orchard, and a culinary residency program that brings in chefs from across the country every summer. Denise Marsh's granddaughter runs the front desk full-time and is, by every metric, better at the job than I ever was. Aunt Ruth comes for Sunday dinner every week and still can't quite believe the girl who slept in her floral guest room now employs half the county. Priya visits every August, always insisting she's just checking on her investment, though she never invested $1. Only faith, at exactly the moment I had none left for myself. I heard about Julian one more time, almost a year after he drove away from my fence line for the last time. A former colleague from New York sent me a short article, almost as an afterthought, about a man managing property listings for a mid-sized brokerage 2 states away, working under a boss half his age. No mention of Vance Development Group, no mention of Ashford Tower. Just a name in small print at the bottom of a listing. I read it once, felt nothing sharp, and closed the tab. That, I think, was the real ending. Not the festival, not the confrontation, but the moment his name stopped being able to move anything in me at all. Nathaniel and I got married in the barn we rebuilt together, load-bearing wall exactly where it belonged. My grandmother's orchard stood in full bloom behind us, the same trees I'd once stood beneath and told out loud, to nobody but the crows, that a failure was about to build something extraordinary. Aunt Ruth cried through the entire ceremony. Priya caught the bouquet and pretended she didn't try. Denise Marsh brought a casserole nobody asked for and cried harder than anyone, insisting the whole time that she'd known this was coming since that first summer, which was, generously, not true. Some mornings, I still walk out to that orchard before the guests wake up, coffee in hand, and just stand there in the quiet. I think about the woman who arrived in this town with 1 suitcase and absolutely nothing left to lose, and I think about how certain she was, standing on that rain-soaked New York sidewalk, that her life was over. It wasn't over. It was just finally, for the first time, entirely hers. She did. And she never had to ask anyone's permission to do it. Have you ever found the strength to completely cut out toxic people from your life and watch karma do its job? Or did you feel the need to prove something to them? Comment below. I read all your stories.